The sea was trying to swallow them whole. Eleanor Blackwell clung to the iron railing of the SS Providence as the ship heaved and buckled beneath a sky that had turned the color of a bruise. Rain came not in drops, but in walls, cold, merciless, biblical. The screaming of the wind was so savage it drowned the screaming of the passengers, and those passengers were screaming with everything they had. She could not find Clara. In the chaos of tilting deck and rushing water and 100 bodies all pushing in opposite directions, Eleanor had lost her sister, the only person she had left in all the world, the only reason she had climbed aboard the ship in the first place, the only soul who shared her blood and her grief and her impossible hope that somewhere across this black, raging ocean, God had prepared a better life for two Irish girls with nothing but their faith and their courage. And then she heard it, her name, cutting through the storm like a blade. Eleanor! It was not Clara's voice. It was a man's voice, deep, commanding, and it was the most terrifying and the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, because in that one word, her name, spoken by a man who had every reason to let her drown, Eleanor Blackwell understood that God was not finished with her yet. She had no idea in that storm-shattered moment that the man fighting his way toward her through the torrential dark was fighting for far more than her life. He was fighting for his own. If you love deeply moving Christian stories of faith, unexpected love, and God's extraordinary providence, you are in the right place. Welcome to the Blessed Christian Storyteller. Please like this video, leave a comment telling us what you feel as the story unfolds, and subscribe so you never miss a story. God brought you here for a reason. Now settle in, because this one is going to reach your soul. The village of Kilross, County Cork, smelled of peat smoke and rain and the kind of poverty that settles into stone walls like damp and never quite leaves. It was September of 1909, and the morning that Eleanor Blackwell said goodbye to Ireland was the kind of morning that Ireland specializes in. Gray, soft, heartbreakingly beautiful, with mist rolling off the hills like the sigh of something ancient and grieving. She stood at the gate of the cottage where she and her younger sister Clara had been born, the cottage where their mother had hummed hymns while she kneaded bread, the cottage where their father had read scripture aloud on Sunday evenings by the fire, his great calloused hands holding the Bible like the most precious object in the world, which to him it was. Both of their parents were gone now. Their mother 3 years past, their father just 6 months ago, taken by a winter cough that had no mercy for a man who had already given everything he had to give. Eleanor was 23 years old. Clara was 19. They had 14 pounds between them, 2 traveling cases, and a letter from their mother's second cousin in Brooklyn, New York, a woman named Mrs. Bridget Mahan, who had written to say she might find them work as domestics if they could make the crossing. Might, Clara had said when they had read the letter, her voice wavering. She says, might. Might is enough, Eleanor had replied, and she had believed it. She still believed it, standing at the gate with the mist on her face and the ache of leaving pressing against her ribs like a stone. She believed it because she had to believe it, because the alternative, despair, was a door she refused to open. She was her father's daughter through and through, fierce faith, stubborn hope, a laugh that arrived before she could stop it even in the worst moments. She had his dark auburn hair and her mother's green eyes, and a heart that no matter how many times life struck it, simply refused to harden. Clara, slight and fair and prone to anxious spirals of thought, tucked her hand into Eleanor's arm as they walked away from the cottage for the last time. "Do you think God really has something waiting for us in America?" she asked. Eleanor looked at the gray sky and thought of her father's voice reading the 31st Psalm on cold Sunday nights. "Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart," she quoted softly. "All ye that hope in the Lord." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not an answer, Ellie." "I know. It's better than an answer. It's a promise." The steamship SS Providence was not the grandest vessel crossing in the autumn of 1909. That distinction belonged to the great ocean liners, whose passenger lists read like almanacs of the wealthy. But the Providence was solid and steady, and known for making the crossing in 7 to 8 days, which is why a man like Sebastian Hargrove had booked passage on her. Sebastian did not like ships. He did not like the smell of them, the motion of them, the enforced proximity to strangers, the way the horizon disappeared at night and left you with the unsettling sensation that the ship was the only solid thing remaining in the universe. He had made this crossing 3 times for business. He was a partner in Hargrove and Caldwell, an architectural firm in Boston that was rapidly becoming one of the most sought after in New England, and each time he had stood at the railing and thought, "I will never do this again." And yet, here he was again, because of James. James was 5 years old and recently seen a picture book about Irish castles and had decided with the absolute certainty that only a 5-year-old can muster that he absolutely must see a real castle before his 6th birthday. His mother in Dublin, who had not met her grandson yet, had extended an invitation. It seemed, suddenly, worth it. Worth it, and yet Sebastian stood at the railing of the Providence as she moved out of Cownstown Harbor and felt the familiar cold knot in his chest that had nothing to do with the sea and everything to do with the fact that standing at railings reminded him of Margaret. Margaret loved railings, loved standing at heights, loved the wind in her hair and the feeling of being on the edge of something vast. It had been Margaret's idea to honeymoon in Portugal, to stand on the cliffs above the Atlantic and let the spray soak them both through, laughing. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years later, Margaret died in the fever epidemic that swept through Boston in the winter of 1906, and she took with her most of what Sebastian understood about joy. He was 32 now. He had a son who needed him. He had a firm that demanded him. He had a life that was full in every measurable way and hollow in the way that mattered most. And he had made his peace with that, or at least he told himself he had. He turned away from the railing, and that was when he heard the crash from the first-class corridor and the sound of a child crying and went to investigate, and found James sitting on the floor with a split lip and tears streaming down his cheeks, and beside him, kneeling with a handkerchief already pressed to the wound, and a voice so steady and warm that it was like a fire in a cold room, a young woman with auburn hair and green eyes who was saying, "There now, brave one, I've seen knights take worse tumbles than that. You're going to be absolutely fine. What's your name, Sir Knight?" James sniffled. James. James. A king's name, that is. A very fine name indeed. Now, James, can you tell me, were you running? Because I should warn you, this particular section of corridor has a terrible reputation for defeating runners. It's practically famous for it. And James, impossibly, laughed. Sebastian stopped in his tracks. His son had not laughed like that in months. Eleanor had not meant to end up in the first-class corridor. She and Clara were traveling steerage, they could afford nothing else, and the distinction between steerage and first class on the Providence was not merely a matter of cabin quality, it was a matter of worlds. The steerage passengers were housed in the lower decks, in dormitory-style berths that smelled of salt and close bodies and anxiety. The first-class passengers inhabited an entirely different ship, polished wood and cut glass and menus with French words on them. Eleanor had wandered into the wrong corridor while looking for the washroom, and had just been turning to go back when the little boy had hurtling around the corner at full speed and launched himself directly into a brass fixture mounted on the wall, and that was that. She could not walk past a crying child. She simply could not do it. Her mother called it her greatest virtue and her most inconvenient quality, depending on the day. She was still mopping James's face when she became aware of the very large, very still presence in the corridor behind her. She looked up. The man was tall, considerably taller than the doorway suggested he ought to be, with a kind of face that probably was called handsome before grief had carved its lines into it. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw set with the permanent tension of a man who had learned to hold everything together through sheer force of will. He was dressed impeccably, but it was not the clothes that struck Eleanor. It was the expression. He was looking at James with something so raw and so carefully contained that Eleanor had to look away for a moment, the way you look away from something holy. "I apologize," she said, getting to her feet and offering James her hand to rise. "I was in the wrong corridor entirely. Your son took a knock, but I don't think it's serious. The lip will be a bit swollen tomorrow, but—" "How did you make him laugh?" the man said. Eleanor blinked. It was not the response she had expected. "I beg your pardon?" The man seemed to realize what he'd said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite embarrassment, but a cousin of it. "Forgive me. I'm Sebastian Hargrove, and you are—" "Eleanor Blackwell. I'm traveling with my sister. Steerage," she added, because it seemed better to say it before he noticed the state of her code. He nodded, as though steerage were of no consequence whatsoever. "Miss Blackwell, James's nanny took ill before we departed and had to leave the ship. I find myself in the rather urgent position of needing someone to watch him for the duration of the crossing. 7 days. I would, of course, compensate you and your sister generously, move you to a first-class cabin for the voyage, and—" "Yes," said Eleanor. Sebastian paused. "I haven't finished. You said 7 days, you said first-class cabin, you said generous compensation. I said yes. I would have said yes after 7 days. Is there something terrible in the rest of the offer?" James, who had been listening to all of this with round eyes, looked up at his father with an expression that was unmistakably hopeful. Sebastian Hargrove looked at Eleanor Blackwell for a long moment. Then, and she would think about this moment for the rest of her life, one corner of his mouth moved. It was barely a smile. It was the ghost of a smile, the memory of one. But it was something. "No," he said, "there's nothing terrible in the rest." James Hargrove was, without question, the most delightful child Eleanor had ever met. He was small for 5, with his father's dark hair, and what Eleanor came to understand had been his mother's laugh, free and sudden and completely unguarded, the laugh of someone who hadn't yet learned to hold back. He was curious about everything, the way the propellers sounded from below deck, the name of every visible constellation, why salt water tasted different from river water, whether fish could get seasick, and whether Eleanor believed in dragons. "Of course," Eleanor said the first time he asked. James's eyes widened. "You do? Really? There are all kinds of dragons in this world, James. Some of them breathe fire. Most of the really dangerous ones just breathe doubt." He didn't entirely understand this, but he tucked it away with the solemn certainty that it was important, the way children do with things that feel true, even when they are beyond their comprehension. He was also, she quickly discovered, carrying a grief too large for his small body. He never spoke of his mother directly. Eleanor gathered that Sebastian had not yet found the words to speak of her either, and so the silence had become the family's language for that particular pain. But sometimes James would go very still in the middle of playing, and his eyes would go somewhere far away, and Eleanor would simply sit beside him without speaking, and after a while he would come back. On the 3rd day, during one of these silences, he said, "My mama went to heaven." "I know, sweetheart. Papa doesn't like to talk about it. Sometimes when people love someone very, very much and they lose them, talking about it is almost too hard to bear. It doesn't mean your papa loves your mama any less. It means he loved her so much the loving still hurts. James considered this. Does it hurt forever? Eleanor thought of her father, reading psalms on cold nights. She thought of her mother's hands. It changes, she said carefully. It doesn't go away, but it changes shape. It becomes quieter. It becomes something you can carry instead of something that carries you. James slid his hand into hers. Will you tell Papa that? Eleanor's throat tightened. That's something your papa will need to figure out in his own time, James, but I think he already knows more than he lets on. Sebastian Hargrove, Eleanor decided on the 4th day of the voyage, was a fortress. Not a ruin, not someone broken and unreachable, but a fortress. Solid, deliberate, every wall placed with intention, every gate locked. He was polite to her, professionally courteous, in the precise way of someone who has decided that professional courtesy is the maximum they will offer the world. He was an exceptional father, patient with James in a way that clearly cost him when his reserves were low, present in a way Eleanor recognized as a choice, not an impulse, but he never offered more of himself than the situation required. Except sometimes. Sometimes at dinner he would forget to be careful. Eleanor would say something, usually something ridiculous because she had a constitutional inability to resist a well-timed absurdity, and he would look at her across the table with an expression of complete unguarded surprise, as though she had appeared in a room he thought was empty. And then the curtain would come back down. She wasn't trying to charm him. She wanted to make that clear to herself, firmly and repeatedly. She was doing a job. She was in the fortunate position of being fed excellent food and sleeping in a real bed for the remainder of this crossing. And at the end of it, she would have enough money to ensure that she and Clara arrived in New York with a proper cushion between themselves and destitution. That was all. That was enough. The fact that Sebastian Hargrove had the kind of eyes that made her feel, somehow, that she was being seen more clearly than she was comfortable with, that was simply something she would ignore. On the 5th evening, after James was asleep, Sebastian found her on the promenade deck watching the stars. James is settled. I know, I checked on him 20 minutes ago. He came to stand at the railing beside her. Not close, a proper distance, but close enough that she was acutely aware of him. May I ask you something, Miss Blackwell? You may ask. Whether I answer depends on the question. Another ghost of that almost smile. Fair enough. What are you hoping for in America? Eleanor thought about the honest answer. She gave it. A roof that leaks, work that's honest, enough to eat and enough left to put something by. A place for Clara to feel safe while she figures out who she is. And maybe eventually, not yet, but eventually, something that looks like a proper life. Not a great life necessarily, just a real one, a whole one. Sebastian Hargrove was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific answer. You asked a very direct question. She turned to look at him. The stars were extraordinary out here, away from any light on land, and they caught in his dark eyes. Most people say opportunity, or a fresh start, or the American dream. Most people are afraid to say what they actually mean. She met his gaze. What do you hope for, Mr. Hargrove? He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I'm not sure I've hoped for anything in quite some time. The honesty of it landed between them like something fragile. Eleanor didn't say anything. She understood suddenly that this was not a man who made confessions easily, that this small, precise statement was from him the equivalent of someone else pouring out their heart entirely. She said only, "Then I'll hope for the both of us tonight." And she turned back to the stars, and after a moment, he turned back to them too, and they stood there in the extraordinary silence of the open ocean, two people who barely knew each other, both of them looking up. Clara Blackwell was not by nature a suspicious person, but she was a watchful one, and she had been watching. "Ellie," she said on the 5th evening after Eleanor returned from the promenade deck with the stars still somehow in her eyes, "I need you to be careful." "About what?" "With Mr. Hargrove." Eleanor's hand stilled. Then she resumed unpinning her hair. I'm being perfectly careful. You came back from a walk to check on James with the same look on your face that Mary Callahan had when she fell for the Fitzgerald boy, and that ended her weeping in our kitchen for 3 weeks. Clara. She was serious. I'm serious, Ellie. He's a wealthy American widower who's hired you temporarily. In 2 days, this ship docks in New York and he goes to Boston and we go to Brooklyn. And that is the end of that. Whatever your... Nothing is happening, Eleanor said, finally meeting her sister's eyes. She said it firmly, and she meant it. And only the tiniest part of her, the part that had stood at a railing under Atlantic stars and felt for the first time in years that someone had actually looked at her, registered the word as a kind of loss. Nothing is happening, she said again, quieter. Nothing can happen, so there's nothing to be careful about. Clara looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of younger sisters who know everything. All right, Ellie, she said gently. All right. It came without warning, the way the worst things always do. The 6th day of the crossing had been tranquil, the kind of clear, cold Atlantic day that makes you understand why sailors fall in love with the sea. The water a deep and shifting blue, the light extraordinary. Eleanor had spent the morning teaching James to play a card game her father had taught her, and the afternoon reading aloud to him from a collection of adventure stories, and by evening she had allowed herself to feel that this was, in its strange way, one of the better weeks of her recent life. The storm rolled in from the northwest just after midnight. Eleanor heard it first in her sleep, a change in the sound of the ship, a new urgency in the groaning of the hull. She came awake all at once, the way she had learned to do in childhood when the Kilross winters brought storms that tested even solid stone walls. Clara was already sitting up in her berth, eyes wide. The Providence lurched. Everything that could slide, slid. Clara grabbed the iron post of her berth. Eleanor, already on her feet, stumbled against the wall and caught herself on the porthole frame. The porthole was black and white, the white being the spray that hit it in great crashing swipes, making the glass shudder in its casing. James, Eleanor said immediately. I have to get to James. Ellie, you can't go up there. But Eleanor was already pulling on her boots, and then her coat, and then she was out the door into the lower corridor, where the overhead lamps were swinging wildly on their fixtures, and 3 other passengers were pressed against the walls with the expressions of people who have just remembered that the sea is very large and ships are very small. The journey from steerage to the first-class deck normally took 4 minutes. That night it took 20, and it nearly killed her twice. Once when a wave struck the ship broadside with a sound like the end of the world and sent her careening into a bulkhead. Once when a fire door swung open and caught her across the shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise she would carry for 2 weeks. But she made it to James's cabin. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open to find James sitting in the center of his berth with his arms around his knees, rocking slightly, his face bleached white with terror, but, and this was the thing that broke her open, making no sound. He was 5 years old, and he was facing this alone in silence because no one had told him it was all right to be afraid. Eleanor crossed the cabin in 3 steps and gathered him into her arms. Oh, sweetheart, I'm here. I've got you. He pressed his face into her neck and finally let himself shake. I'm scared, he whispered. I know, that's all right. Being scared is allowed. Do you know what I do when I'm scared? He shook his head against her shoulder. I say, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? I say it over and over until I believe it more than I believe the fear. Do you want to try? His voice was very small. I don't know all the words. That's fine. Say what I say. The Lord is my light. The Lord is my light, and my salvation, and my salvation. The ship lurched again. Eleanor held James tighter. Whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? James whispered into her shoulder. The door of the cabin burst open. Sebastian stood in the frame, coat unbuttoned, hair wild, the look on his face of a man who has just run through a ship listing at 15 degrees and hasn't stopped to consider what that means. He saw James in Eleanor's arms. He crossed the room, and for a moment Eleanor thought he was going to take James from her, but instead he sat beside her on the berth and put his arms around both of them, around his son and around this woman who had come for his son in the middle of a night storm that no sensible person would have walked into. And Eleanor felt, in the circle of that arm, the exact specific warmth of something she absolutely was not going to name. "The crew is saying it'll pass in a few hours," Sebastian said. His voice was admirably steady. "The ship is in no danger of—" And then the lights went out, and in the darkness, from somewhere deeper in the ship, they heard a sound that no passenger on any ocean voyage ever wants to hear: the alarm bell, frantic and continuous, and above it, the voice of a ship's officer shouting words that turned Eleanor's blood to ice. "All passengers to the boat deck. This is not a drill." What happened, they would learn later, was this: a section of the engine room had been overwhelmed by the flooding that the storm drove through a compromised hull plate. The Providence was not sinking, not exactly, not the dramatic slide beneath the waves of catastrophe's worst imaginings, but she was badly wounded, taking on water in a controlled way that the crew was managing but could not fully stop, and the captain made the decision to evacuate the first-class passengers as a precaution while the engineers worked to seal the breach. Precautionary evacuations, however, look exactly like catastrophic ones from the inside. The boat deck was bedlam. People in various states of dress, some with luggage, most without, children crying, a woman in an evening gown standing completely still in the middle of it all as though she had simply decided not to participate. The crew, to their enormous credit, were attempting to organize the chaos, directing passengers toward the lifeboats with the particular combination of calm authority and barely concealed urgency that is the hallmark of people who know how bad a situation is than they are saying. Sebastian had James in his arms. Eleanor was beside him, one hand on James's back, the other gripping Sebastian's sleeve, not for fear for herself, she told herself, but because she needed to know where they were in the dark. Sebastian was pushing through the crowd with controlled force, making a path, his eyes fixed on the nearest lifeboat station. Then Eleanor remembered Clara. The thought arrived with the force of a physical blow. Clara was still below. Clara was in steerage, and the steerage passengers, she could see it now, looking back toward the hatch she had come through, were being held at the bottom of the stairwell while first class evacuated. A crew member was holding a rope across the hatch, like a barrier. Eleanor stopped. Sebastian, whose sleeve she was holding, stopped too, jerked back by her sudden stillness. "Miss Blackwell, my sister is below. They won't let the steerage passengers up." Sebastian looked at the hatch. He looked at the crew member. He looked at his son in his arms. And then he said, with the quiet authority of a man who has never been told no in his life and has no intention of starting tonight, "Hold James." He handed his son to Eleanor and walked with steady and deliberate steps toward the crew member blocking the hatch. Eleanor watched him speak to the man. She couldn't hear the words over the wind and the alarm and the noise of the crowd. She saw the crew member shake his head. She saw Sebastian say something else. She saw the crew member's expression shift, not convinced but outgunned, and then the rope came down, and the passengers from below began to come up, and Clara's face, white, terrified, magnificent, appeared in the hatch, and Eleanor's legs nearly gave way with relief. She pushed toward her sister. They met in the middle of the deck and held on to each other with the grip of people who had already lost everyone else. "I thought—" Clara started. "Don't." Eleanor pulled back and looked at her. "Are you hurt?" "No. Are you?" "No." James, still in Eleanor's arms, patted Clara's cheek solemnly. "Don't be scared," told her. "The Lord is my light and my salvation." Clara blinked. She looked at Eleanor. "He's very good," Clara said faintly. "He really is." Sebastian reappeared at Eleanor's shoulder. He looked at Clara and said, Miss Clara Blackwell. Miss Blackwell, I'm glad you're safe. We need to get to the lifeboats." They moved together, Sebastian and Eleanor and Clara and James, through the chaos of the boat deck toward lifeboat number 7. It was a small group moving as one organism, navigating by instinct and the particular fierce intention of people who have decided that they are going to survive this. They made it to the boat. They survived. All 4 of them, huddled in a lifeboat on a heaving Atlantic in the dead of night, watching the lights of the Providence from a safe distance while the crew worked to save her. And they did save her. She limped into New York Harbor 2 days later under her own power, while the storm slowly spent itself and the stars came back, and James fell asleep against Eleanor's shoulder, and Clara fell asleep against Eleanor's other shoulder, and Sebastian Hargrove sat across from Eleanor in the narrow lifeboat and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before and could not name. She would spend the next several months trying to name it. New York arrived the way Eleanor had always imagined it would: enormous, gray, improbable, overwhelming in the way of things that exist only as an idea in your mind until suddenly they are real, and so much larger than the idea that the idea feels like an insult to them. They were processed at the customs dock, all 4 of them, by some administrative miracle, together, and emerged into the organized cacophony of Lower Manhattan in the October of 1909, with their luggage, their papers, and the specific, stunned silence of people who have crossed an ocean in a lifeboat and are still slightly surprised to be standing on solid ground. Sebastian had arranged a hotel. Not for Eleanor and Clara, that would have been improper, and he was a man for whom propriety was a matter of deep instinct, but he arranged for his driver to take them to a respectable boarding house in Brooklyn, near the address of their mother's cousin. He stood on the dock while the driver loaded their cases, and James held Eleanor's hand and refused, with great 5-year-old determination, to let go. "James," Sebastian said quietly, "Miss Blackwell needs to go. Can she come with us? She has her own destination. But, James." James looked at Eleanor. His lip wobbled. Eleanor crouched down to his level. "Listen to me, brave one. Do you remember what we say?" He nodded, eyes bright and full. "Say it for me." "The Lord is my light and my salvation." That's right, and that is true everywhere, in New York, in Boston, anywhere you go. And it's true for me too, wherever I go. So we are never really apart from the things that matter. He let go of her hand, but he cried, silently, with the devastating dignity of a child who has already learned that some feelings are private, 2 tears running straight down his face. Eleanor pressed a kiss to his forehead, stood up, and turned to Sebastian. He was watching her with that expression again, the one she couldn't name. "Thank you," she said, "for the cabin, and for the other thing." She meant the hatch, Clara. He nodded. He seemed to want to say something else. The something else didn't come. She turned to go. "Miss Blackwell." She turned back. Sebastian Hargrove stood very straight, with James's hand in his, on a New York dock in October, and said with the careful precision of a man who has thought about this more than he is admitting, "If the position in Brooklyn doesn't suit, or if you find yourself reconsidering the nature of your next step, I have a card." He held it out. She took it. She looked at it. "Sebastian R. Hargrove," it said. "Hargrove and Caldwell Architecture, 14 Pemberton Street, Boston, M.A." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," she said, and she walked away. She kept the card. The thing about Mrs. Bridget Mahone, they discovered within 24 hours of arriving in Brooklyn, was that she had moved. The address in the letter was 3 years old. The new tenants of the apartment on Fulton Street had no idea where she had gone, and were, moreover, considerably irritated about being asked. They had enough money for the boarding house for 2 weeks, perhaps 3 if they were careful. Clara found work first, in a laundry, hard and hot and exhausting, but honest. And Eleanor began the systematic process of looking for a position as a domestic. She went to 3 households in Brooklyn, 2 in Manhattan. In 2 cases, she was not considered educated enough. In one, she was considered too educated. The lady of the house, she sensed, did not want a parlor maid who could clearly hold her own in a conversation. And in 2, she was simply told there were no positions. On the 9th day, she took out Sebastian Hargrove's card. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about James, she thought about the lifeboat, and she thought about the fact that nothing, actually, had happened. He had employed her. He had been decent to her. He retrieved her sister from below deck. These were all professional and human courtesies. The card was a professional and human courtesy. Writing to him would be a professional and human courtesy in return. She wrote to him. His response came by return post in 3 days, faster than she had expected. It was brief. Sebastian Hargrove was, as she would come to understand, always brief. It said, "Miss Blackwell, I'm glad you wrote. James has asked for you daily since we arrived in Boston. My current nanny situation remains unresolved. If you are willing to travel to Boston, I will arrange your transportation and accommodation, and we can discuss terms. S.R. Hargrove." She read it 4 times. She read it 4 times looking specifically for the part where it was a terrible idea, and found only that it was practical and straightforward, and that James had asked for her daily. She wrote back, "I will come." She was in Boston within the week. The Hargrove house on Marlborough Street in the Back Bay neighborhood of Boston was the most beautiful house Eleanor had ever been inside. It was a 4-story brownstone with bay windows that collected the afternoon light like cups filling with gold, a front parlor of considerable elegance, a library that made Eleanor's heart physically ache with longing, and a kitchen staffed by a cook named Mrs. Hooper, who was the approximate size and temperament of a productive thundercloud. There was also a housekeeper named Mrs. Delaney, Irish from Galway era, 50 years old and suspicious of everything until proven otherwise, and a butler named Forsyth, who had the expression of a man who had seen everything twice and found it all slightly beneath him. And there was James, who met Eleanor at the door and launched himself at her with the entirety of his small self and the words, "You came!" "I came," Eleanor agreed, catching him and staggering slightly. "Were you uncertain? Papa said you might not." Eleanor looked up over James's head at Sebastian, who was standing at the foot of the stairs with a look that was either mortified or something more complicated, and said with great dignity, "I said it was possible you might have found other arrangements. That is not the same thing." "It is a little the same thing," James said. Eleanor laughed, and Sebastian looked at her, that look again, and turned and walked back up the stairs. Mrs. Delaney appeared at Eleanor's shoulder. "He's been impossible since the boy started asking for you," she said in a conspiratorial undertone that suggested she had decided in the 30 seconds since Eleanor's arrival that Eleanor was an ally. "He had the room prepared twice?" Eleanor blinked. "Twice. Said the curtains were wrong the first time." Mrs. Delaney's expression was magnificently neutral. The curtains were perfectly fine. Eleanor looked up at the staircase where Sebastian had disappeared. The curtains, she told herself firmly, meant nothing. The months that followed had the quality of a dream you know is a dream while you're having it and choose not to wake from. Eleanor settled into the Hargrove household with the unconscious ease of someone who has arrived somewhere they didn't know they were going. She was brilliant with James. This was acknowledged even by Mrs. Delaney, who acknowledged things reluctantly. Inventive and patient and consistently surprising, able to turn a rainy afternoon into an adventure and a tantrum into a negotiation and a lesson into a game without appearing to try at any of it. She also, without particularly intending to, made herself indispensable to the rest of the house. She reorganized the library, with Forsyth's grudging assistance, in a way that was actually logical, rather than a decorative arrangement it had been. She discovered that Mrs. Hooper, the cook, had a secret terror of mice, and quietly, because she was from rural Ireland and had no problem with this, dispatched the mouse that had been living under the pantry shelves for 6 weeks and reduced the cook to grateful tears. She helped Mrs. Delaney draft a difficult letter to a relative. She mended the fraying edge of a parlor drape because she walked past it and couldn't not do it. Sebastian watched all this. He was not, he told himself, watching her. He was simply a man who was present in his own household and therefore aware of what occurred within it. That he was aware of precisely where Eleanor was at most hours of the day, aware of her laugh that carried through walls, aware of her voice reading to James in the evenings, rising and falling with the story, and aware of the sound of her on the stairs at night when she checked on James before bed. All of this was simply the heightened awareness of a man who ran an orderly hellhole and attended to its rhythms. He told himself this reliably every day. It was Clara's arrival that changed things. Clara had saved enough from the laundry to travel to Boston, and Eleanor had asked, quietly, not wanting to presume, whether her sister might stay in the house while she looked for work, just for a short time. Sebastian said yes before she finished asking, which made Eleanor look at him oddly, and him look away. Clara arrived with her traveling case and her watchful eyes, and within the first evening she had assessed the entire situation with the thoroughness of a surveyor, and that night when Eleanor brought her tea, she said, "Ellie, that man is in love with you." Eleanor spilled the tea. "That is absolutely not. He watched you pour James's cocoa for 4 minutes." He rearranged where he was sitting so he could continue watching you pour James's cocoa. Clara, he asked Mrs. Delaney this morning what your favorite flower is. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed. He what? Mrs. Delaney told me because she thought I would find it interesting. Which I do. Clara sipped her tea with the serenity of someone holding all the information. She told him you liked wildflowers. He looked, and I quote Mrs. Delaney, like a man doing sums in his head. Eleanor sat down. She sat down because her legs had done something unreliable. It's probably just, she started, stopped. He's probably just courteous, professionally. Ellie, I am begging you, with all the love in my heart, stop. Nothing can come of it, Clara. Why not? Because I work for him. Because he's a wealthy Boston architect from a family of Boston architects, and I am an Irish girl from Kilross who arrived here with 14 pounds and no connections. Because people in his position don't. Eleanor marry Blackwell, Clara said, with the force of someone invoking all 3 names on purpose. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known, and the most completely blind about it. Now drink your tea. Eleanor drank her tea. She thought about wildflowers for a very long time before she slept. Sebastian Hargrove proposed on a Tuesday. It was not, he would reflect later, the most elegant proposal in the history of marriage. It was not planned. He had, in fact, been planning a very different, much more careful, considerably more dignified proposal involving a proper occasion and the right setting and a speech he had been composing in his head for 6 weeks. What actually happened was this. Eleanor came into his study to tell him that James had a head cold and would not be attending school the following morning. This was a perfectly unremarkable piece of household information. Sebastian thanked her. She turned to go. He watched her turn to go. And something in him, some long-locked thing, simply opened. Miss Blackwell. She stopped, turned back. Her hair was slightly disheveled. She'd been chasing James, he could tell, and she had ink on her left index finger from helping James with his letters that morning, and she was looking at him with those green eyes that seemed to see everything he was trying not to show. And Sebastian Hargrove, who had built his entire adult life on the principle of considered and measured action, said, "Would you marry me?" Eleanor stared at him. A full 5 seconds passed. A 6th. "I beg your pardon?" He could feel the blood in his face. He could also not, at this point, take it back. Not because it was too late, but because it was simply true, and he was a man who could not unknow a true thing once he'd stated it. "I'm aware that this is unexpected," he said. He stood up from behind the desk because it seemed wrong to conduct this from behind furniture. "I've thought about this considerably, more considerably than this moment suggests." Eleanor had not moved. She looked, he thought, exactly like a person who has just been told the building they're standing in is going to move. "Mr. Hargrove." "Sebastian, please, under the circumstances." She took a breath. "Sebastian, why?" He had not expected that question. He should have. "Because James loves you. Because this house has been more of a home in the months you've been here than it has been in 3 years. Because you are..." He stopped. He had been about to say something that was more than he was prepared to say, and retreated, because it would be a practical arrangement that benefits both of us. You would have security, James would have consistency, I would have... He stopped again. A housekeeper, Eleanor said. She said it carefully, without heat, but she heard the edge. That's not what I mean. What do you mean? He looked at her for a long moment. The speech he had been composing for 6 weeks was entirely unavailable to him. I mean that you would be my wife, in name, with all the protections and provisions that entails, and Clara would have a home here as well, for as long as she wanted. I ask nothing of you that you are not willing to give. Eleanor was very still. She was thinking, she could see her thinking, and he watched it happen and waited and did not push. James, she said finally. Yes. The arrangement would be clear between us, professional. Something contracted in his chest. If you prefer, you understand what I'm saying. I understand. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, all right. Yes, Sebastian let out a breath. Yes, yes, for James. And because... She paused. Something moved across her face, something he couldn't read. Because I think we can make it work. She nodded once as though sealing the agreement with herself and turned and walked out of his study. Sebastian sat back down at his desk. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at the door she had gone through. For James, she had said. What he had not said, what he was now going to have to figure out how to say, or whether he was ever going to be able to say it, was, I would give everything I have left to give if you wanted it. They were married quietly on a Thursday morning in November at the small Episcopal church on Clarendon Street, where Sebastian had been a member for 15 years. The rector, Father Emmons, a compact, bright-eyed man who had buried Margaret and now married his husband with the expression of someone who understands that God moves in ways that are not always immediately explicable, but are always, eventually, coherent, performed the ceremony with reverence and not a word of editorializing. Clara stood as Eleanor's witness. James stood as his father's, wearing a new suit and the expression of a person attending the best event of their life. Mrs. Delaney wept. Forsyth did not weep, but his posture was somewhat softer than usual. Eleanor wore her one good dress, dark green wool, simply cut with a spray of white heather that Sebastian had left outside her door that morning without explanation. She picked it up from the doorstep and held it for a long time before pinning it to her lapel. When Father Emmons said, Sebastian, do you take this woman? And Sebastian said, with a steadiness that meant something, I do. Eleanor looked at her hands and thought about the word arrangement and tried very hard not to feel it as a loss. When Eleanor said her own I do, Sebastian was looking at her. She didn't look up. After, on the church steps, James took both their hands and stood between them and said, with enormous satisfaction, now you can't leave. Eleanor laughed. It was a small laugh and a slightly complicated one. No, I suppose I can't. She did not look at Sebastian. Sebastian looked at her. Sebastian Hargrove began courting his wife 3 days after the wedding. Eleanor did not notice. This was, Clara would later say, possibly the most impressive display of obliviousness in recorded history. It began with small things, a book left on her breakfast tray, a collection of Irish poetry, with a brief note in Sebastian's handwriting. I noticed you looking at this in the library. It began with him adjusting his schedule on Saturdays so that he was home for the afternoon, which meant 3 hours of the 4 of them, Sebastian, Eleanor, James, and Clara, when she was not working, occupying the same parlor, reading or talking or playing games, while the Boston winter pressed its gray face against the bay windows. Eleanor interpreted all of this as the behavior of a man who was thorough and organized and considerate of the people in his household. This, she told herself, was simply who he was. This was professionalism and decency. He was not wooing her. That was not what this was. He brought you flowers yesterday, Clara said in February. He was passing a florist and thought of the household. He bought wildflowers in Boston in February. He had to go to 3 different vendors, Ellie, because Mrs. Delaney checked. Eleanor looked up from her mending. Mrs. Delaney checked? Mrs. Delaney is invested in the narrative. There is no narrative. Clara looked at the ceiling. She appeared to be asking God for patience. He reads in the parlor now instead of the library. He prefers the parlor light. The library has better light. You said so yourself. Clara, he learned 3 Irish songs, Ellie. A pause. What? James told me. He heard Papa asking Mrs. Delaney to teach him the ones you hum when you're working. Clara folded her hands. He learned them so that you would feel at home. Eleanor set down her mending. She sat with this information. She sat with it the way you sit with something that you know is going to change everything if you let it, and you have been trying very hard for a series of very good reasons not to let it. It's still an arrangement, she said finally. Clara's voice was very gentle. Ellie, when a man learns your songs, it's not an arrangement anymore. Eleanor stood up. She walked to the window. The Boston street was gray and cold, a fine icing of snow on the windowsill, people moving below in their winter coats. She had been terrified, she realized. She was still terrified. Not of Sebastian, not of the house or the position or the practicalities, but of the part that wasn't practical, the part she could lose, because she had already lost everything once, her mother, her father, her home, her country. She had built this careful version of herself that wanted only what it could count and weigh and hold, a roof, honest work, safety for Clara, and had kept her heart in a very small, very protected room and called it enough. And now, what if, she said to the window very quietly, I want more than an arrangement and he doesn't. Clara came and stood beside her. She put her arm around Eleanor's shoulders. Ellie, she said, I think the question you should be asking is, what if he does? The dinner at the Caldwells, Robert Caldwell being Sebastian's business partner, his wife Victoria being the sort of woman who managed a room the way a conductor manages an orchestra, was the first significant social occasion to which Eleanor was invited as Mrs. Sebastian Hargrove. It did not go entirely smoothly. Eleanor was not intimidated by Victoria Caldwell. She was not intimidated by the dining room with its 12 settings of actual gold-trimmed china, or the other guests who were the kind of Boston Brahmin whose families had been quietly significant for generations. She was not intimidated because she had survived a lifeboat in the Atlantic in October and had decided, somewhere in those dark hours, that very few things were actually as frightening as they appeared. What she was honest, which was, it turned out, the problem. A woman at the table, Mrs. Agatha Pemberton, a widow of considerable years and considerable opinions, asked Eleanor, with the careful politeness of a question that is not actually polite at all, how she had come to know Sebastian. I was engaged as a nanny on a ship crossing from Queenstown, Eleanor said. James needed someone after his previous nanny fell ill. I was in steerage. The table went quite quiet. Eleanor continued because she saw no reason not to. There was a rather bad storm on the 6th day, and Sebastian, Mr. Hargrove, was kind enough to make sure my sister and I got off the ship safely. We arrived in New York, I came to Boston to take the position permanently, and here we are. Mrs. Pemberton's expression was doing several things at once. Victoria Caldwell's expression was someone watching something very interesting happen. How very romantic, Mrs. Pemberton said. Not especially, Eleanor said pleasantly. It was rather wet and cold, as I recall, and the lifeboat was quite uncomfortable. But God was good and no one drowned, so on the whole, I consider it a success. Sebastian, sitting beside her, made a sound that might have been a laugh, and which he immediately converted to a cough. Victoria Caldwell did laugh openly, and said, I like this woman, Sebastian, across the table, with the authority of someone whose approval is rarely given and therefore means something when it is. The dinner recovered. Eleanor talked with Robert Caldwell about architecture. She had read 3 of the books in Sebastian's library on the subject, from boredom and then from genuine interest, and Robert looked at her with the expression of a man who was reassessing several things at once, and by the end of the evening, something had shifted. She could feel it. In the carriage home, Sebastian was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You don't have to do that." Eleanor looked at him. "Do what?" "Volunteer information about steerage, about the crossing. They what?" She kept her voice level. "Are they going to think less of you for having a wife who doesn't pretend to be something she isn't? Or think less of me? Because I can't help them with that, I'm afraid." Sebastian was quiet. "I'm not ashamed of where I come from," Eleanor said. The carriage wheels were loud on the cobblestones. "I'm not ashamed of you either, or of any of this. But I won't perform a different history for other people's comfort. I can't." "I wasn't asking you to," Sebastian said, very quietly. "I was trying to protect you." Eleanor turned to look at him fully for the first time since they'd gotten in the carriage. He was looking straight ahead, jaw set, and she saw it then, clearly, perhaps, for the first time, that what she had been reading as management and control was actually something else, was something closer to fear. He was afraid for her. Not of her, for her. She didn't know in that moment what to do with that, so she looked out the window at the Boston night and said nothing, and the carriage carried them home, and the distance between them felt both smaller and larger than it ever had before. The crisis arrived in March, in the form of a letter. It was addressed to Sebastian from a woman named Cornelia Winthrop of the Back Bay Winthrops, who had been, apparently, before Margaret's death, considered a likely match for Sebastian by certain quarters of Boston society. The letter was elegant, sympathetic, and almost too carefully casual, a letter that said in its polished language of its class several things it had no intention of appearing to say. The letter was elegant, sympathetic, and almost too carefully casual, a letter that said in its polished language of its class several things it had no intention of appearing to say. Eleanor did not read the letter. She had no idea a letter existed. What she knew was what Mrs. Delaney told her, because Mrs. Delaney had intercepted the letter as part of her habitual screening of the household correspondence, a habit that Eleanor suspected Sebastian was unaware of, and had not mentioned it to Sebastian, but had mentioned it that evening to Eleanor with the expression of a woman delivering intelligence that is important and potentially explosive. "Miss Cornelia Winthrop has written to himself," she said, 3 pages, and I shouldn't say more than that. "Then don't," Eleanor said immediately. But Mrs. Delaney said more. She said, "There was talk before you of an understanding between them, nothing official, but the kind of talk that's more serious than it appears. She's unmarried still, and she was very fond of him." Eleanor was quiet for a long time after Mrs. Delaney left. This was the moment. This was the moment that she had been carefully not thinking about, the point at which she would have to face what the arrangement actually was and what it wasn't, and what she wanted it to be, and whether that was something she was allowed to want. She went to find Sebastian. He was in the library. She came in without knocking. She had stopped knocking weeks ago. The formality had eroded. And he looked up from whatever he was working on, and she said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He set down his pen. "All right. Was this—" She stopped, started again. "Is this marriage something that you intend to maintain indefinitely?" Sebastian looked at her steadily. "It is a marriage, Eleanor. It is by definition indefinite." "You know what I mean." "I'm not sure I do. What are you asking?" She crossed her arms, not defensively, gathering herself. "I'm asking whether you married me because it was genuinely what you wanted, or because you needed a practical solution and I was convenient." A long silence. "Where is this coming from?" "It doesn't matter where it's coming from. It does to me." She looked at him. He was looking at her with an intensity that was almost too much to hold. "Mrs. Delaney," she started, "Mrs. Delaney told you about Cornelia Winthrop's letter." It wasn't a question. He exhaled. "I see. Is she—" "There is nothing between myself and Cornelia Winthrop, Eleanor. There never was, despite what various people in this city may have hoped. She is a kind woman, and I have no interest in her whatsoever." He stood. "The letter will be returned unanswered." "That's not quite the question I asked." He looked at her. Something was happening in his face, something she recognized now that she'd learned his face well enough to read it, as a man approaching the edge of something he has been carefully walking around for months. "I know it isn't," he said. "Then answer the question I asked." The silence that followed was the longest Eleanor had ever sat in. Then Sebastian Hargrove said, with the exactness of a man who chooses every word like a footstep on uncertain ground, "I married you because because you have been the first person in 3 years who has made me feel because James needed you, and because He stopped. He looked at her. "Because I asked you." And the simplicity of it was not a retreat, it was an arrival. Eleanor's breath left her, and then she did the most unexpected thing. She sat down. Just sat down on the library floor, with her knees drawn up and her hands over her face, not weeping, something bigger than weeping, something that had no name, the feeling of a door opening that you had boarded shut so long ago you had almost forgotten there was a door. Sebastian was beside her in an instant, not touching, asking with his presence whether he was allowed to. "Eleanor." She lowered her hands. Her face was not what she would have chosen it to be. It was entirely unguarded, entirely present, entirely hers. "I was so afraid," she said, "of wanting this, of wanting more than what we said it was. I kept telling myself it was an arrangement, because if it was an arrangement, I couldn't lose it the way I've lost everything else." He reached out and took her hand. His hand was large and warm and entirely steady, the hand of someone who has decided. "You cannot lose what is freely given," he said. "I am not going anywhere, Eleanor. I have not been going anywhere since the moment you told that frightened little boy that being scared is allowed." She looked at him. She looked at him properly, fully, without the careful management she had been applying to every moment with him for 6 months, and what she saw made the last corner of her fortified heart surrender with almost no resistance at all. "That was on the ship," she said. "You fell in love with me on the ship." "I believe," Sebastian said, with the expression of a man who was both embarrassed and completely at peace about it, "it was somewhere around the part where you told James you'd fought worse dragons, yes?" Eleanor laughed. It came out of her bright and sudden and real. "You absolute—" "I know. You could have said something. You were very committed to the idea that nothing was happening. She stopped. "Clara is going to be insufferable about this." Sebastian laughed. It was not the ghost of a laugh or the memory of one. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has come back to himself from somewhere very far away, and it filled the library and the hallway beyond, and quite probably the whole of Marlborough Street, and from somewhere upstairs there was a small voice. "Papa, is everything all right?" Sebastian and Eleanor looked at each other. "Yes, James," Sebastian called. "Everything is very much all right." And then he lifted Eleanor's hand and pressed it to his lips, and she let him, and that was that. The garden on Marlborough Street had never, according to Mrs. Delaney, looked like much. The house's previous mistress had let it go, not from negligence, but from the simple fact that she had been ill and then gone, and Sebastian had maintained it in the way of someone keeping something alive out of duty rather than love, which is to say it survived, but without flourishing. Eleanor had planted wildflowers in it in April. They were, in late May, in extraordinary bloom, violet and yellow and white, impractical and glorious, and completely wrong for a formal Back Bay garden in every way that mattered to conventional taste. Mrs. Delaney loved them. James loved them. Forsyth had no official opinion, but had been observed standing in the garden doorway on 3 separate occasions, looking at them with an expression that was dangerously close to pleasure. Sebastian had said, when he saw them first, "These are not exactly conventional," and Eleanor had said, "No, they're better." He had kissed her then, in the garden, and she had let him, and James, who had been watching from the parlor window, had made a face and gone back to his book. That evening, after James was asleep, they sat together in the parlor, Sebastian reading his architectural papers, Eleanor reading her Irish poetry, the fire warm and the room quiet, and the garden outside with its wildflowers settling into the dusk, and Eleanor said into the comfortable silence, "My father used to say that God doesn't just redeem our losses, He redeems our roads, the whole journey, including the parts that felt wrong." Sebastian looked up from his paper. "He sounds like he was a very wise man." "He was." Eleanor looked at the fire. "I couldn't see it on the ship, or in the boarding house when we couldn't find Cousin Bridget, or even in those first months here, when I was telling myself so hard that nothing was happening, that I couldn't hear anything else." She looked at him. "But he was building it all along, wasn't he? Every piece of it." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then, "I stopped praying after Margaret died. I kept going to church because James needed it, and I didn't know how to stop doing the things I was supposed to do, but I'd stopped talking to God. I was too angry." "I know." He looked at her. "You knew that?" "I could see it. You had the look of a man doing all the right things out of habit rather than faith. I recognized it because I wore it myself after my mother died." She paused. "What made you start again?" Sebastian looked at the fire. Then, with the precision of a man who means exactly what he says, "A woman on a ship taught my son a psalm in the middle of a storm." He looked at her. That seemed like a message worth receiving. Eleanor felt the tears come before she could stop them. Not sad tears, the other kind, the kind that arrive when joy is too large for the ordinary containers. She said very quietly, "The Lord is my light," and Sebastian, who had learned the words, who had been learning them, she understood now, since the moment he heard her say them to his frightened son in the dark, completed it. "And my salvation, whom shall I fear?" Outside, the wildflowers moved in the evening wind. Above them, through the parlor window, a single star appeared, first of the night, brilliant and steady, and very much there. Grace, Eleanor Hargrove thought. That is what we call it when God takes the broken pieces of 2 people and builds something whole. Grace, upon grace, upon grace. Friends, if this story moved you, if it touched your heart, or reminded you that God is working even when we cannot see it, please leave a comment below. Tell us what part spoke to you most. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded today that God does not waste a single chapter of our lives. Subscribe to the Blessed Christian Storyteller so you never miss a story, and hit the notification bell so God's next message for you comes straight to your screen. May you walk in the light of His love today and every day. God bless you.